NBC Magazine with David Brinkley and NBC News correspondents Betsy Aaron, Douglas Kiker, Jack Perkins, and Garrick Utley.
A television first. From inside Afghanistan, a poor country the Russians are trying to destroy and can't. Betsy Aaron and an NBC Magazine crew walked into Afghanistan for 11 days in danger and brought out a detailed, fascinating report.
Everybody thought they will wipe us out in 1 week, but we are addicted to freedom.
Good evening. We're glad to have you with us. Tonight we have a report unlike any you have seen before. A detailed look inside Afghanistan, a small, poor country the Russians invaded more than a year ago, and they're trying to destroy it and subdue it, and they are finding they cannot, because its strong, tough mountain people would rather die than have the Russians take them over. They are dying, but so are the Russians. Something like 2,000 Russians killed so far. No outsiders are allowed in the country, and certainly no reporters. But Betsy Aaron, with a crew from this program, walked into Afghanistan for 11 days, carrying cameras and equipment, and then walked out with a brilliant, fascinating report. We'll be back with that and a great deal more. Betsy Aaron, the Russian leaders won't allow us, any of us, to see their war and describe it because they want to be left free to tell whatever lies they like, and they've told a great many. But you walked through the mountains into Afghanistan, saw what the Russians are doing to a simple peasant people trying to destroy their country, and finding it is not easy because the Afghan people are tough, tougher than the Russians are. Tell us what you found.
David, when the Russians first moved into Afghanistan, there were lots of people in this country who said, this is great, they're going to get theirs. They're going to get bogged down in their own Vietnam. Well, that's just about happened with them on a smaller scale. If there were any lessons to be learned from the Vietnam fighting of the guerrillas, what we did learn is that the Russians haven't learned anything. They even tried a Hearts and Minds program, shipping off Afghan soldiers to the Soviet Union to do what they called educate them. Well, when those soldiers came back home, what they did was desert to the guerrillas. Before the invasion, there were close to 80,000 Afghans in the Afghan army. Now that that army is controlled by the Russians, the figures are 25,000 and dropping. The Afghans call the Russians godless, and they certainly aren't buying any of the Soviet message.
A Russian tank fires up at a mountain. Afghan rebels fire back on a fort. This daily battle is a symbol of what this war has become. The Russians, prisoners in their forts and in the cities. The rebels fighting, they insist, to the last Afghan.
Until we die, we will carry on until we die.
Everybody thought they will wipe us out in 1 week, but we are addicted to freedom.
That addiction carries a heavy price, because during the year the Russians have been here, villages have become ghost towns, and more than 1 million survivors have become refugees. And yet the Afghans will not give up. Why did the Russians come here? What did they want? What they didn't want was a fundamentalist Islamic country right next door. What was happening in Iran made that even more important. And if the Russians could control Afghanistan, then they'd be that much closer to the Persian Gulf and to the oil. Afghanistan has had a long history of neutrality, but the Russians began to get nervous about Afghanistan back in 1978. The country's first communist president, Mohammad Taraki, was killed by supporters of another communist, Hafizullah Amin. Amin became Afghanistan's second communist president. The communists were in power, but they clearly couldn't control the country to the Soviets' satisfaction. So in December of '79, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan, and President Amin was killed by Russian troops. President Babrak Karmal was now sitting in Kabul, Russia's hand-picked communist puppet. Presidents weren't the only Afghans killed. In the first 18 months of communist rule, thousands were locked up, at least 10,000 executed.
Why?
The world reacted. At the UN, the Security Council called for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all foreign troops. From the Soviets, a veto. And from President Carter, a grain embargo, an Olympic boycott, and words.
And this, in my opinion, is the most serious threat to world peace since the Second World War.
Those words were answered by gunships and the presence of 80,000 Russians. It's been over a year now since all that happened. As documented by Soviet television, the Russians control the cities, the rebels hold the mountains. And for over 1.5 million Afghans who just can't take it anymore, the way out is to Pakistan. 1 out of every 10 Afghans has taken this route to freedom. We retraced their steps through these mountains into Paktiar province in southeastern Afghanistan. We went in illegally. If you're an American journalist, that's the only way to get in. We walked for 11 days and for part of 11 nights, crossing 3 mountain ranges following the traditional caravan route. In the stillness, the sound of gunfire in the distance has become routine as the movement of the camels on this Afghan route to and from Pakistan. The Russians control so much of the paved road that this road, such as it is, has become a lifeline for the mountain people. One Afghan passes another on a mountain trail. His greeting, Stare Mashe, may you not be tired. Food brought in from Pakistan is keeping man and animal alive. And guns smuggled in from Pakistan are helping to keep the war alive.
In the last 2 years, many men have died from my province. Many courageous mujahideen have died.
He's 28. Before the war, a student studying French at Kabul University. Now a commander of troops from the province of Wardak. His name is Amin of Wardak.
We've lost over 4,500 men in my province alone.
And yet you still continue to fight.
We believe that we are washing our country clean with our blood, but we will never leave our country to our enemies.
This rebel camp is less than 2 hours' drive from Kabul, if the road were open. There are thousands of freedom fighters, mujahideen, living in these hills. The gunshots, a traditional Afghan welcome. This is a male-only society. Women do not seem to be missed. The camp commander is a priest, a warrior leading his men to do God's work, to fight a jihad, a holy war. He is respected because he is a priest, but he is the commander because he has proven himself to be a leader.
Every Afghan will remember this tragedy and will fight these infidels, whether they have any weapons in their hands or not.
Not all mujahideen are devout Muslims. While some are fighting to create a fundamentalist Khomeini-like Afghanistan, others are more moderate. And still others are fighting because for an Afghan, fighting is a way of life. There's a saying that Afghans would rather fight foreigners, but if there are none around, they'll be happy to fight each other. Some charge that because of this, they're not as effective as they could be against the Russians.
We're not fighting among ourselves. We're
Dr. Salaluddin Shpoon, an Afghan intellectual who spends most of his time out of the country trying to get support for his people.
You don't fight with your brother when you are under such a severe attack. There's no disunity. There's lack of organization, and that's purely military, and we're learning to remedy that.
They may be solving some of their problems, but meanwhile the Russians are emptying out the countryside, creating refugees.
450 people used to live in this village. Now all but 90 of them are refugees in Pakistan. The 90 who decided to stay live up in the hills, and they only come to town during the day to farm. The Russians didn't get rid of these Afghans with bombs, but they accomplished the same thing.
The Russians have forced thousands of Afghans out of villages along the border. But in the interior, it's a different story. We learned about conditions in the center of the country from Gerard Cahout, a French doctor who's been walking across Afghanistan for 8 months, treating all who need help.
Well, the situation is, of course, quite difficult for the people, but at least they are completely free there. It's a very mountainous place in this very high mountains. And during the past year, they have succeeded to free their country completely from the government troops and the Russians. In the whole of Azarajat, which is a place that has about 5 million inhabitants, there are just 2 or 3 places with an army garrison, and the rest of the country is completely under control and administered by the Mujahideen.
The fighting for control of the countryside has only made a bad situation worse. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world, and its people are illiterate. At least 90% of them are. So many of the children are sick, and so are the adults. The sound of coughing is as common as the sound of gunfire.
What do we have? We have only God. We have nothing else.
How are the children surviving?
They are hungry, but they have to be patient. They have to endure.
The refuse of war becomes a toy for a child. When the child becomes a man, he'll earn the right to use a gun. For these children, war is a way of life. It was a way of life before the Russians. An eagle may provide a meal. There is little food now, usually just some naan, unleavened bread, washed down with some green or black tea. But on rare occasions, there is rice, or a goat, or a chicken, or an egg. Those occasions are very rare. But there's no shortage of talk for these people who can't read or write. And the talk revolves around the war and their weapons. Where did you get that gun? May I see it, touch it, use it? And hours are spent cleaning it. A gun is probably the most valuable possession a man has. It has to be earned, taken care of, used. When they're not fighting, they spend hours socializing and listening to the radio in a roadside tea house.
This news is coming to you from Radio Moscow World Service.
The BBC, Radio Moscow, and the Voice of America tell them about their war.
The Afghan Minister of Education, Anahita Ratibzad, has said that the withdrawal of the limited Soviet army contingent from Afghanistan depends on whether a full political settlement of the problem is reached.
So the Afghans are informed. They know that President Carter called the invasion of their country the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. And they wonder why. If that is true, why doesn't America help?
Today we want the world to help us, God willing, regain our rights. We have been wronged. We have suffered cruelty. Tell the world that.
Whatever money we had, we spent on the war. We don't have any blankets, nor any clothes, nor shoes. And we don't have any rifles and weapons, the kind that the Russians have or the rest of the world possesses.
But they do have some Russian weapons. A few captured bazookas and many Kalashnikov rifles are brought by deserters from the Afghan army. A soldier carries a wooden plane, the only plane these freedom fighters have. It's a pitiful display by some very proud men. And to top off the comic opera quality of their effort, they carry the ultimate 20th century weapon, the cassette tape recorder, used to record and to play back their battles. They've had plenty of chances to tape this battle because every day they climb this hill to fight. So far, 52 of their men have died here.
This hill and all the hills around this place are controlled by the Mujahideen, but down in the valley, right over the trees behind me, there is a fort controlled by the Russians. From that fort, the Russians bombard this area every day. But because the Mujahideen control the hills, the only way the Russians can get supplies in and out of that place is to airlift them in or to drive them in by tank.
The fort is not an especially strategic one. It just happens to mark the end of rebel territory in this province and the beginning of Russian control. The almost routine attack on it by the rebels won't drive the Russians out, but it will serve to remind them of how unpopular they are.
Attention, another one.
In turn, the tanks the Russians use remind the rebels of their lack of firepower.
I don't see one more.
I think we better get out of here, guys. They're flashing right at me.
Are we seeing an annihilation of a people? Are we seeing a superpower with all the time in the world, just waiting it out, starving them out, moving them out?
Well, the Afghan people also have time. They have, in their history, they have been fighting all the time. And I can figure that for the Russian army, it's also not an easy task for the average Russian soldier to be sent here in this place, being told that there are Chinese or American soldiers to fight against, finding none of these, and just being employed and sent to bomb villages or make attacks on civilian people. It must be quite depressing and demoralizing. So maybe time is also working for the Mujahideens.
And there have been Mujahideen victories. This stretch of road was captured from the Russians after long and bloody battles. The scars are everywhere. Armored personnel carriers and tanks left where they died. The truck we ride in was captured from the Russians. The gas to run it must be carried in from Pakistan. After riding for a little over an hour, we reach the end of the line for the truck. The village has been heavily bombed, but some of its women have chosen to stay.
How many people have been lost in this village?
Out of 23 families in this village, only 3 families survive intact. The grown-ups of 20 families have been killed. Only their children and widows survive.
Do the children have nightmares about the Russians and the bombs and the planes?
Look at them. See how they weep. See how they tremble. The children are terrified of the helicopters. When you came, they thought you were from the government. But look at what they have done to us. They drop bombs on us over and over.
If you could talk to the rest of the people of the world, what would you want them to know?
We need weapons for jihad. Our husbands are being slaughtered. We need food.
I've been quite moved by the condition of these people and the injustice of this war, and the contrast between the one very great power on one side and one of the poorest people in the world on the other side, fighting for their freedom.
The people of the world must realize that the communists are not only the enemies of Afghanistan, but they're the enemies of the whole world. Every people of the world, every country which has ideas that are contrary to the communists will be attacked by the communists one day.
We are getting a bit disillusioned about help coming from outside. Not that we won't welcome it, but we will fight without or with or without outside help.
The first heavy snowfall came early this year, the beginning of the second winter of the war. Before the Russians came, life was hard. Now it's harder. But despite the hunger, despite the killing, despite the suffering, the Russians are still a long way from defeating these people.
So what we found was a countrywide rebellion against the Russian try at taking over Afghanistan. Despite all the odds, the rebels seem to control most of the countryside, while the Russians do hold the cities. But there are reports that even in those cities, the guerrillas are attacking the Russians, sniping at them while they go to the store in their tanks. It's clear that if the Russians pulled out, the government they put into power in Kabul would collapse in a minute. Because for now, the rebels have been able to fight the Russians to a standoff. It's a little too early to tell whether all the pressure the rebels are putting on the Russians will lead them to the negotiating table, or whether there will be more years of fighting.
Betsy, what you and Joe DeCola did in Afghanistan, excellent. Is there any thought of how long this might last? Can the Afghans hold out?
You know, David, it's incredible. If you ask the women who are at home suffering, every woman will tell you they will hold out till the end and through the end. And the men will tell you that when all the men are gone, the women will fight. But privately, one of the commanders did say to us, this is the last winter. If we don't get some help, they're going to come in here, we're going to lose. And he's so angry that he said then he'll pick up the communist flag and he'll march to the Persian Gulf.
What about outside help? What is the prospect of it? You have looked into this.
Yeah, I have. There is some help coming in. The man who's really hollering most loudly for the help is President Zia from Pakistan. When we got out of Afghanistan, we stopped in Islamabad to see him. He's got 1.5 million refugees in his backyard. It's costing him a lot of money. The Russians are furious that he's letting them in. He wants to negotiate and he wants help. At the Muslim conference, he was in the forefront for pushing for negotiations. I think most of the help right now is coming from Egypt.
Is there any guess, we have heard something here, any guess on what the Reagan policy will be on helping the Afghans?
Yeah, I want to back up a little bit. Joe DeCola and I talked to a senior White House official in the Carter administration, and he said what the policy toward Afghanistan had been was to fight the Russians to the last Afghan. And he explained that by saying there was no way we were ever going to give any direct aid to Afghanistan, but he intimated that we were helping the Egyptians, and we were giving them all sorts of aid so that they would then, in turn, turn it over to the Afghanistan.
Well, the Reagan policy, what I hear is that he is likely to help them. Have you heard?
It looks like it. He certainly campaigned on a tough policy of being tough with the Russians, and Secretary Haig talks about hard line and linkage and domino theory. So I'll tell you one person, President Zia, is very happy to have Ronald Reagan in the White House. He has high hopes of getting more aid than the $40 million he turned down from President Carter.
The Afghans feel that if killed in a holy war, they will go straight to heaven with an express ticket, right?
You're absolutely right, and I'll tell you something, it makes you feel very nervous when you look around.
Because you don't feel this way.
And you're surrounded by those men.
Okay, Betsy, again.
Thank you.
Thank you. For all of us at NBC Magazine, thank you and good night.
Jessica Savage interviews Lily Tomlin Monday on Today. And next Friday, Marvin Kalb investigates whether the United States can defend itself in a non-nuclear war on NBC Reports. Who will fight for America?
Why America's soldiers are leaving the military. NBC Reports next Friday.